In today's journey, we're going to reveal the super secret successful storage secrets. Something so simple, you'll wonder why you didn't think of it sooner. But first, let's start with some stuff that you don't actually need. I know, how strange, a YouTuber's telling you that you don't need to click the links in the description, even though that would help us out. They're not useless, it's just they're overhyped. For example, these Mylar bags. While great for those dedicated to bulk buying or growing their own hops, pair with the oxygen absorber and the vacuum sealer, and you have the next to best thing to nitrogen-filled bags. And don't get me wrong, these things are amazing. They block all light, so hops are protected. There's extremely low oxygen permeability. Their only downsides end up being that they are pricier than other bags, and they can be tricky to seal and vacuum properly. The secret, though, is that unless you're a doomsday prepper, this is probably overkill for what you need. It is great when manufacturers use Mylar bags, as it shows an extra level of care for the product. But you, the end user, should not be repackaging unless it's your calling in life and you are dedicated to proper label making. I've met more than one pretentious brewer who thinks that Mylar bags are the secret to making anything more than half decent. But the only time we would use Mylar bags is if we wanted to put some rare and exotic hops into the deep freeze, but that becomes a non-starter because we probably would also just keep them in the package that they came in. They're usually full of nitrogen, and if you're a fan of foreshadowing, you might notice a trend here. For example, you may have noticed a bag full of forbidden fruit snacks, also known as oxygen absorbers, most commonly known as that thing inside of the beef jerky packages. These most commonly work by creating a chemical reaction to produce rust that will use the oxygen inside of the container. This is great for beef jerky because it'll keep the oxygen levels low while allowing the moisture to be high, while at the same time avoiding spoilage. But then you have to ask yourself, if an oxygen absorber would be so good for storing homebrew ingredients, why don't I see any manufacturers using them? Or better yet, why aren't homebrew stores using them as an upsell? Well, that is outside of the crown caps with the oxygen absorber. That actually is useful and should use. So the industry is familiar with them, but we don't sell packets at homebrew stores because they don't provide a meaningful impact on your storage in a way that would be beneficial for homebrewers. They are again great for doomsday preppers, and they are vital for them. But for us, they're kind of an unneeded expense. So, feel free, go ahead and buy them, but they're not going to make your beer, wine, or anything better, except for your beef jerky. This next one's kind of on the fence, as they are useful to have around, but they're not going to be the deal breakers that people will make them out to be sometimes. Silica gel desiccants absorb moisture in the air, and when we do use them around the studio, we usually aren't using them for food items. Mostly it's just for keeping equipment dry when it's in storage. Other brewers report using them for keeping chemicals dry, and I've even heard people of using buckets full to keep a kegerator dry. Either which way, for your safety, make sure that you're following the manufacturer's guidelines and that you're not creating a chemical reaction or forgetting to recharge them. But if they don't put these into dry malt extract bags, then that's probably telling you something. Because, again, you're telling me that a homebrew store is going to pass up on the opportunity to charge you an extra 50 cents to give you a silica pack to put in your dry malt extract bag. That's just silly money on the table. Don't worry, we're almost to the super secret. Just one final item that's overhyped for storage uses, and that's the vacuum sealer. But we bought one so you don't have to, and a great way to support us is to like, comment, and subscribe. Or another great way to support our channel is to buy one of our cheat sheets, have it printed as a magnet, so that you can keep all the dilution ratios, mash temperatures, and all those odds and ends chemicals with the scientific names. Sure, it's all stuff I know already, but it's nice to have it handy for reassurance, especially late at night. And since it's from the same place that does my photography printing for my fine art, you can also get anything from my catalog printed in the same style of magnets. This also means that if you are more adventurous, you could have the cheat sheet or any of my art printed on more exotic materials, such as metal, stretched canvas, or thin wraps. Or at the very least, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. It helps more than you think. And of course, if you already have a vacuum sealer, you should totally use it to do great things, such as vacuum sealing spare ingredients, or sealing Mylar bags. And of course, my favorite use, for the purpose I bought it, cooking sous vide. That's cooking under vacuum. While this is a must-have for those who grow their own hops or run a homebrew supply shop, the average homebrewer, on the other hand, has little to gain by spending over $100 on a single tool that does very little, especially when other options like this guy's available for about $30. Not only that, but it's also battery operated, and check out how quickly Phil's able to turn this neutral grain spirit into whiskey. In all seriousness, he's just preparing his oak for using in a cider. According to him, it's a secret weapon to get the most oaky oak flavors out. It's also a great way to get more of the whiskey or wine or whatever base liquid you're trying to impart flavors from into whatever you're putting them into. He calls it supercharging. On another note, he also withheld the information that you can use the vacuum sealer to degas wine. Not completely tested yet, so we're not endorsing. But what we will endorse is the opinion that a vacuum sealer is somewhat useful if you're willing to make the investment and set your expectations that it's not going to be the game changer that the perfect fermenter can be. It's not just the cherry on top, it's the hat on the hat. You are so established as a home brewer that you're starting to run out of things to make your brews better. It's not something you think you'll need, it's something you know you need. And if you think yourself to be a little more eco-friendly than others, then definitely go with the mason jar style. On the other hand, you could be a monster like Phil and use the vacuum seal bags to store equipment that's not used often. This is especially great for brew tubers because we can store equipment that we got for review and don't really plan on using for a long time. And this actually brings me back around to a general complaint about all of these solutions. They're not inherently bad, they're just kind of wasteful for what they are. And brewing and home brewing, we already create enough waste. It takes about 7 gallons of water to make 1 gallon of beer. That's just the water. And since nothing's free, that means the cost of making your batch is going to get more and more the more crap you add on. The only thing I ask is that before you pull the trigger on using any of these items, to stop, think, is this going to make your brew day faster, easier, or safer? For example, a tilt hydrometer is expensive and pointless, but also it means that I take my hydrometer readings on a regular basis and I don't endanger my beer by having to open it and take a reading every day. And even though a traditional hydrometer reading would be more accurate, it would be a bit impractical for me to sit there and do it every 15 seconds, whereas a tilt hydrometer will do that for me. And it can be data logged, allowing me to track the health and status of my yeast, meaning this just made my beer better, faster, and safer. That's nice. But now that all the losers are gone, let's talk about the secret I was talking about. Actually, let me show you. This is a pound of Bree's cherry wood smoked malt. And from what I learned at my fancy brew school was that the trick to getting the most out of this ingredient is to use all of it at once. Just design your recipe based on what you can buy, and then you don't have to store it. It might not always be possible, but is your recipe being complicated what makes it good? Or is the way you brew it what makes it good? And let's say hypothetically maybe you need to keep some grains around. Here's something else important to remember. They've been preserved for storage already. The shelf life of malted grain is 1 year. 6 months if cracked. And speaking of crack, grain is crack for mice and other rodents. That's why it's recommended to store your grains on elevated platforms or inside of food-tight containers. And you don't have to take my word for it, as it is well documented in history that a big part of how human culture evolved to the state that it is due to the longevity of stored grain. Some may even refer to it as a revolution in agricultural fields. Now, it is easy to sit here and say that you should buy only the exact amount of grains you need, as a lot of homebrew shops make that easy, whereas hops, that's a little bit different of a story. Especially if you like brewing IPAs or anything that's heavily hopped, as there is a lot of savings to be had by buying by the pound versus by the ounce. Just keep in mind that all homebrew stores have their own policy on handling their hops. For example, when I worked at a smaller brew store, we only sold exotic hops in their original packaging, but more common varieties like Cascade would be broken down from 1-pound bags. We just didn't have the space to keep those 44-pound bags laying around. Unlike when I worked at one of the big stores, where hops and yeast yeast were my departments. New hops, such as when the Australians first started coming around, would have been kept in their original packages, because we don't know how well they're going to sell. Uncommon hops would be purchased in 10-pound increments, and extremely common ones, such as Cascade, would be purchased in 44-pound bags. Everything would stay in the manufacturer's bags until we were ready to do some restocking. First, they'd be broken down into 1-pound bags, and then the 1-pound bags would be broken down into the 1-ounce bags. This would be done without desiccant, oxygen absorbers, or a vacuum sealer, and hell, Mylar bags were constantly denied when I requested them. The big store did not start upgrading their hop storage solutions until a smaller store that I worked at started applying pressure. And for full disclosure, within our own brewing space, we don't follow our own advice here. We buy way more hops than we should, especially exotic and new ones to try out. But that's why I have a box full of about $200 worth of hops that probably aren't good anymore. Except all the ones that are within manufacturer bags. Those are good for up to 5 years, especially since they've been in a freezer that whole time. So suspiciously, to get the most out of my hops, I did not need to spend $200 on equipment. I, however, have all the equipment, so I may as well use it. And that's the interesting position that the storage wars will really put on you. Yes, there are best practices, but for the most part, the average home brewer doesn't need to pay attention to them as long as they follow very basic guidelines. And like we said before, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and check out some of our other videos if you'd like. Happy brewing!